Welcome to episode 96 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, the word all spelled out, so SEVEN, health.com/96.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey boys and girls, welcome back to an episode of Real Health Radio. This week it's a show where I'm just doing another solo episode, so it's me taking a deep dive into one topic. And this week's chosen topic is Hashimoto's disease. So this show's kind of been a long time coming. Back on episode 23, I did a whole podcast show that was about the thyroid and how it works and some of the conditions that can affect it. And I briefly mentioned Hashimoto's disease, but it was always something I wanted to do more with and to go in with the topic into more detail on. And then last year, I had a number of clients with Hashimoto's disease. And so I found myself reading and researching more about it. And so finally, I've got around to recording a show about it. So I read a number of books that have informed me or informed the information from this show. I mean, these aren't the only sources because there's been lots of articles and blog posts and also stuff that I've learned from clinical experience. But for anyone who's interested, the books that I had specifically read about Hashimoto's, so the first was Why Do I Still Have Thyroid Symptoms When My Labs Are Normal by Karazian, and I really enjoyed and found this helpful, the book. There's definitely things that I disagree with, probably in terms with how strict or restrictive a lot of the recommendations are around kind of food and diet or the amount of supplements that are recommended, but this is a really solid book and it's very well explained. Then there was Hashimoto's or Healing Hashimoto's Savvy Patient's Guide by Dr. Alan Christensen. And this just reads like a transcript from a talk, like someone has just taken a recording, put it in a word form without any editing and just made it a book. And they didn't do a great job in terms of the editing because there are lots of typos or times where it felt like they couldn't understand the word that Dr. Christensen had said, so they just picked something that sounded like it might fit. But despite this, I'm actually quite fond of this book, and I found it quite helpful. Dr. Christensen feels less extreme in his recommendations in comparison to Dr. Karazian, but it's also a much shorter book. So you could knock it out in an afternoon or one very long sitting. The next was Stop the Thyroid Madness by Janie Bowthorpe. And this one I found more helpful in specific areas or specific sections. It is very well researched and it has some incredibly helpful information. It does have a very anti-doctors, anti-medical establishment stance, which I know it's not that uncommon with books about health, but for whatever reason, it just felt a little like it was taking it further than the norm and like I was reading some kind of conspiracy website. And I don't know if you ever check out the website Natural News. It must have been an OK Health website at one point when I was first reading it years and years ago, but it has now completely gone off the deep end. It's just full of conspiracy theories. If you want to waste half an hour and have a laugh, go and check out Natural News. And it is unfair for me to put this book into that same category because it is not out there like that. And I will say I've been incredibly lucky with my health. And maybe I'd feel very differently if I'd spent years and years being told like symptoms are all in my head or being given misinformation before I had to figure out the whole thing on my own or use internet forums to figure it out the way that Janie Bowthorpe has. So it is a very helpful book with lots of information, and I'm not disappointed that I read it. There was just something about the writing style that bugged me. So maybe as a resource, it's fantastic, just not so much for me anyway, reading it from cover to cover. I've also listened to different podcasts by people like Dr. Dr. Isabella Wentz. I haven't read her books yet, but I have heard her being interviewed. And as I said, I've read lots of other blogs and articles on the topic, as well as other books previously relating to thyroid issues more in general. So people like Dr. Broda Barnes and Dr. Mark Starr. So what I want to do with this show is to look at what Hashimoto's is and how it's diagnosed. I want to talk about the immune system, as this is a big part of the Hashimoto's picture. We'll look at some of the different testing, and I'll comment about this, and I'll also go through some of the dietary ideas or other factors that are often looked at alongside it. So let's start with what Hashimoto's disease is. It's also known as Hashimoto's thyroiditis or chronic lymphocytic thyroiditis, or simply shortened to Hashimoto's. And that's how I'm just going to refer to it for the rest of the time. It's a condition that involves the thyroid gland. And so this is a gland that is in the neck that produces a number of different hormones, particularly thyroxine, T4. And what happens in Hashimoto's disease is that the body starts to produce immune substances that attack the thyroid, which is known as an autoimmune condition. So normally our immune system is good at distinguishing between self and non-self. And anything that is self, it leaves alone. Anything that is non-self, it attacks, or at least thinks about attacking until there's a good reason not to. And this is why if someone has an organ transplant, they're trying to find someone who not only matches as their blood type, but also looking at things like antigens to see how they can prevent it from being rejected. And even with transplants, even when people are matching, patients are given drugs to suppress the immune system so that it doesn't reject the organ because it sees it as non-self. Pregnancy is another example of this. The embryo and then later the fetus is growing in a woman's body despite being non-self. And it's one of the wonders of the female immune system that it can make changes so it doesn't mount an immune attack against it. But there are instances where the immune system does start to attack our own organs. And type 1 diabetes is probably the best known autoimmune disease. And the immune system, it attacks the beta cells of the pancreas, which are the cells that produce insulin. So this is someone who is then going to have to inject insulin for the rest of their life as a type 1 diabetic. You then have MS or multiple sclerosis, where the immune system attacks the myelin sheath of the nerve cells. And this is like the outer protective layer of the nerve cells, like the outer protective layer of an electrical cord. And when you have Hashimoto's disease, in which the immune system it starts to attack the cells of the thyroid gland. And if you're wondering, it gets its name from the Japanese physician Hakuru Hashimoto, who first described it in 1912. But it took a while to catch on, and it wasn't until 1957 that it was recognized as an autoimmune disorder. So I want to briefly run through what should happen in the body when things are working well with the thyroid. And we can then look at what happens in the case of Hashimoto's and how this starts to create a problem. So in the brain, you have a region called the hypothalamus, and it releases a hormone called thyroid releasing hormone, or THR. And this travels to the pituitary. And the pituitary is a gland that is also in the brain, and it releases a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. And this then travels to the thyroid. And when the TSH gets to the thyroid, it stimulates a substance in the thyroid called thyroid peroxidase, or TPO. And through this process and the use of iodine, the thyroid creates two hormones. So one is thyroxine, which is T4, and then there's triiodothyronine, or T3. And you can see why I call it T3, much easier to say. And the number just indicates how many molecules of iodine are attached to the hormone. So T4, there's 4 iodine molecules. T3, there's 3. And although I haven't mentioned it yet, you can also have T2 and T1, which have 2 and 1 respectively. So while the thyroid produces both T4 and T3, the bulk of its production is weighted towards T4. And in Dr. Karazian's book, he states that coming out of the thyroid gland is about 93% T4 and only 7% T3. But T4 can actually be thought about more as a pro-hormone. And in the form of T4, it doesn't do much, but it's the raw material that you then convert into T3. So the T4 that is then released from the thyroid hormone, about 60% of that is converted into T3 in the liver, with small amounts being converted in the heart and the muscles and in the nerves. About 20% of T4 is converted into a temporarily inactive form called T3S or T3AC. And these forms are then taken to the digestive system, and if things are working as they should be, it's then converted into T3 in the gastrointestinal tract. And this is part of the reason why digestive problems and thyroid issues can often go hand in hand. And if digestion is not working well, you're potentially missing out on up to 20% of the T3, and this is really important. And then finally, the remaining 20% of T4 is converted into a substance called reverse T3, which is a permanently inactive form. And this happens when things are working well and naturally. You should be converting about 20% of the T4 into this inactive form. So I hope that was easy enough to follow. I know there are lots of hormones and organs that I'm mentioning that people probably aren't so used to hearing about, but hopefully you are still with me. And what I've described, as I said, that is what should be happening when things are working well in a healthy, normal human being. So what happens with Hashimoto's? In this situation, you start to produce antibodies or immune substances that attack the thyroid gland. And this happens over a period of years and decades. So someone could have it going on for years but be completely asymptomatic. And with the antibodies, there are different types of antibodies that attack different areas or enzymes in the thyroid gland. So you can have antibodies that attack the thyroid peroxidase, which is an enzyme that helps to take the iodine and tyrosine and then turn it into T4 or T3. And this is known as a TPO antibody. You can also have antibodies that attack the thyroglobulin. And thyroglobulin is a type of protein that's created in the thyroid. It's actually the raw material that the thyroid peroxidase enzyme then works on to create the thyroid hormones. And so this is known as thyroglobulin antibodies or TG antibodies. You can also have other autoimmune antibodies like thyroid-stimulating immunoglobulin. God, I can't even say the word. Immunoglobulin or TSH receptor antibodies. But these are less common with Hashimoto's, more likely with things like Graves' disease, so I'm not going to cover them in any detail. Like for Hashimoto's, it's really about the TPO antibodies and then the TG antibodies. So over the long haul, by these antibodies starting to attack the thyroid, it starts to impact on its ability to create the T4 and the T3. And because there's then less of the T4, you're reducing the amount that can be converted peripherally into T3, which would then start to show signs of symptoms similar to hypothyroidism. And hypo meaning low, so symptoms of low thyroid function. But it's not always so straightforward, especially in the early stages, and this is because of the immune system. So I said that the immune system starts to attack the thyroid gland, but the rate of this attack can really ebb and flow. So while being completely oblivious to the situation, someone could start following practices that slow down or completely halt the autoimmune attack for some time, or they could be picking up other habits like dietary factors or lifestyle factors where the immune system really ramps up and again starts to attack the thyroid. And this is why someone can have Hashimoto's for 5 or 10 years and have barely noticed any difference, while someone else can have it for a very short space of time, be in the very early stages, but their symptoms are already quite extreme. And so let's chat about the different symptoms that are associated with hypothyroidism, not Hashimoto specifically, but just hypothyroidism generally. So you have fatigue and weakness, excessive requirements for sleep. You can get weight gain or a decreased difficulty losing weight, coarse, dry hair, dry, rough, pale skin, morning headaches that wear off as the day progresses, puffy face and hands and ankles, hair loss and thinning of the outside third of the eyebrows, red, irritated and dry eyes, cold intolerance, cold body temperature, lack of perspiration, get numbness in the hands and feet, muscle cramps and frequent muscle aches, constipation, depression, irritability, memory loss, abnormal menstrual cycles, decreased libido, weaker immune system. And not everyone that suffers with hypothyroidism is going to have every one of these symptoms, but they can have some of them or they can have many of them. And from a symptoms perspective, it can be tough to differentiate between regular hypothyroidism and it being caused by an autoimmune condition like in the case of Hashimoto's. But there are some symptoms that can point towards this, and this would be having some of the stuff that previous list I've just run through alongside having things like heart palpitations, inward trembling, increased pulse rate even at rest, feelings of nervousness or emotional distress, insomnia, night sweats, difficulty gaining weight. And what stands out when I go through this list is that all of these extra symptoms are associated with hyperthyroidism. So hyper instead of hypo, and hyper means high. So meaning that the thyroid is overproducing hormones, not underproducing hormones. So why would this be happening? Why does Hashimoto's cause this mix of both hypo and hyper symptoms? And it's because of the immune system and the way it attacks the thyroid gland. And when this is happening, it then destroys thyroid tissue. And when thyroid hormones are produced, not all of them are immediately released into the bloodstream. Some of them are stored in the thyroid gland. And when the thyroid is destroyed, hormones that are stored in that tissue then flow out into the bloodstream. And this sudden increase in thyroid hormones then stimulates the body, and the results are then more hyperthyroid symptoms. And this is why someone with Hashimoto's can feel like they swing between being hypo and hyper. And if you check someone's blood tests at regular intervals, you can see this happening. So 1 month things look completely normal. Then the next month their T4 is through the roof. Then the next month things have gone back in the opposite direction. And seeing as I've just mentioned blood tests, let's look at how Hashimoto's disease is diagnosed. And most of the time it takes a number of steps to get to the diagnosis of Hashimoto's. And this isn't because it's particularly difficult to diagnose, it's just because it's regularly overlooked despite how common it is and normally the progression of steps that people go through. So if someone has some symptoms that I just talked about, maybe they go and they see their doctor. And if the doctor suspects there is a thyroid issue, first off, they can examine the thyroid gland with their hands. And so they're looking for any changes. And with Hashimoto's, there is sometimes an enlargement in the thyroid gland. So while the gland is being attacked and broken down by the immune system, the gland also starts to try and swell and enlarge in an attempt to produce more thyroid hormones. And this is known as a goiter. And it can also be firmer than usual, and it may be more tender, but none of that is set in stone. These are just kind of preliminary ideas. So the doctor will then run some blood tests. And there's what I would recommend as part of a thyroid panel and what is normally checked. So on the NHS, typically what is checked is TSH and possibly T4. And often it's just TSH. And if TSH falls in the right range, then someone is told that nothing's wrong, your thyroid is all good. And there's a number of problems with this. And this is something I went into some detail about in my previous podcast on thyroid issues, which you can listen to at www.7-health.com/23. But in short, it's just that the reference range is much wider than it should be. You also have the problem in that with Hashimoto's, you can have times where your TSH and your T4 will look completely normal. As I just mentioned, depending on what tissues are being destroyed, it will impact on the levels of hormones in the blood. So you could easily be tested on one day and it looks normal. And then for the next 1 or 2 years, even if the symptoms persist, you're told that they're not going to test the thyroid again because it was already checked and nothing was wrong with it. The other issue with this is that it's rare that autoimmune antibodies are checked. What seems to be the order of things is that they're the only times that antibodies will be checked if someone's TSH and their T4 are out. And for these to be out, given the incredibly wide reference ranges, means things have to be pretty out of whack. But as I've just described, someone can have Hashimoto's but still have normal numbers. And even when thyroid hormones are out, it's still rare that the antibodies are checked. And I don't know what the standard protocol is for doctors on the NHS, if they should be checking these things and they just don't, or if it's considered rare or it's too expensive and so it's not encouraged. But I've had many clients who have been told that they have hypothyroidism, they're actually on thyroid medication, but then they've never had their autoimmune antibodies checked to see if this could be the cause. And if this is, thyroid medication may help in some ways to get the numbers in the right range, but it's not really dealing with the root cause of what's going on, which is the immune system and how it's causing the problem. And I think that part of the reason for why it might not be checked is there's no medication available to deal with the autoimmune component of the disease. So whether someone is hyperthyroid or has Hashimoto's, they'll still be offered the same medication, which is to deal with the thyroid hormones. And the thinking is often that once the thyroid hormones get in the right range, this will then improve the immune system and the autoimmune issue will just stop. But this doesn't appear to happen or to be true across the board. And look, I will add that some doctors do use naltrexone to deal with the autoimmune side of things. So this is a drug that works on the activity of opioids and was originally used for the management of alcohol and opioid dependency. But it does now have off-label use to deal with many autoimmune conditions like MS or fibromyalgia or Hashimoto's. But it's typically more functional medicine doctors as opposed to your regular GP who would end up prescribing this. Most doctors, it's just not coming up. And so that's how the testing often goes for people. They get the TSH tested, they maybe get the T4 tested, and that's often it. And with this information, it's impossible to make a diagnosis of Hashimoto's disease. So let me then run through what I think would be a better list of things to test so that a diagnosis could be made. Obviously, you want to check TSH, as is already being done. You then want to look at total T4 and total T3, as well as free T4 and free T3. So with hormones, the vast majority of them are bound and they're in an inactive form. So you have this huge supply of them, but very little of it is active. And then you have the free form, which is the active form. So by looking at the total amounts and the free amounts, you're looking at how much of that total hormone is being produced, but also how much of that is then being converted into the free or the active amount. Because if you just look at, say, the total numbers, you don't know how much is in the free form. And you could have a case where total figures are totally fine, but the free figures are really low. And so you would want to deal with this in a specific way. Or if you looked at just the free numbers and they were low, you might not know, is this because the total production is low or it's just because there's not a good amount being converted into that active form. So you also want to look at a thing called reverse T3, which I talked about earlier, as reverse T3 is that permanent inactive form of T3, which should be about 20%. And the reason you want to check this is because if the reverse T3 is in a much higher percentage, this could explain why the free T3 numbers are lower. And while reverse T3 is completely normal and everyone should be producing it, you don't want to have it in those higher amounts. And if it is, it could be caused by different issues. For example, having lower amounts of selenium or having lower amounts of iron can be more likely to lead to higher amounts of reverse T3, or having high or low cortisol, or because of inflammation, this can lead to more reverse T3. But it's just starting to understand more about what's going on with the conversion of those different hormones. You'd also definitely want to check the antibodies. So you want to look at both TPO and TG antibodies, so not just one of them, because you can have situations where someone is high on one but normal on the other, or vice versa. And so you want to check both to see what's going on. And as I mentioned, the immune system fluctuates, and you can have times when it is attacking the thyroid and times when it is more dormant. So if you do a test looking at the antibodies and they show up negative, if there's other things and other symptoms that would make you think that an autoimmune condition is going on, or that Hashimoto's is going on, it's worth doing a second test or a third test just to rule it out, just to see if on those other tests you do then get a positive showing that there are problems. Additionally, you'd want to check for different types of anemias or deficiencies. And the reason for this is twofold. So firstly, it's because many of the symptoms of anemia are similar to that of Hashimoto's or hypothyroidism in general. So just ruling out another potential cause. The other reason is that anemia and hypothyroidism often go hand in hand. So low blood oxygen levels can affect the function of many different systems and organs, including the thyroid. Or if we're thinking about Hashimoto's in particular, it's an autoimmune disease. And statistically speaking, if someone has one autoimmune disease, they're often very likely to develop more. And there's a particular type of anemia called pernicious anemia, which is an autoimmune disease. The body attacks a substance called intrinsic factor in the stomach, which is necessary for the absorption of B12. And when this happens, it can lead to B12 anemia. So it's probably worthwhile looking at different factors directly related to anemia. And so starting with iron, things that are directly relating to iron status, which would be serum iron, ferritin, percentage of transferrin saturation, and TIBC, as well as other things that can help us understand iron anemia, so red blood cells, hemoglobin, hematocrit, NCV, MCH, or MCHC, and MCHC. And then testing folate and B12 to check for deficiencies for both of these, which can lead to anemia. So with all of this, you'll get a pretty good picture of what's going on and if Hashimoto's is likely. There are plenty of other tests and markers that could be added to this, so vitamin D, various sex hormones, magnesium, potassium, sodium, and other markers from the comprehensive metabolic panel. But really, the markers I've just previously mentioned are enough to give you answers specifically about Hashimoto's. So there's a couple of things I want to mention about autoimmune issues in general because I think it's relevant. There seems to be a genetic or at least a hereditary link with these conditions. So if your mum or your sister or your grandfather has Hashimoto's, it's more likely that you will end up with it. And this is something that is very common with my clients. And I have a question on the form asking about the health of other relatives. And it's so common to see that the client's mother or the client's sibling also has Hashimoto's. And this could be behavioral or lifestyle related as opposed to genetics. Like this family has eaten in a similar way, they've lived in a similar way, they've lived in the same area. So this could be the explanation, but it does feel like it goes deeper than this, and it is more to do with genetics, or at least in some cases. The next thing to mention is that autoimmune conditions are much more common in women than in men. So something like 75 to 80% of autoimmune sufferers are women. And this changes in terms of percentage depending on what autoimmune condition you're looking at, and some will go up and down. There is speculation as to why this is the case. And as I mentioned earlier, like women's bodies do these fantastic juggling act during pregnancy to suppress the immune system, to stop it attacking the growing embryo and fetus. But it's not uncommon for autoimmune issues like Hashimoto's to happen post-pregnancy. And scientists speculate that cells from the fetus get into the mother's blood and that this can then set things up for an autoimmune issue. And at this stage, nothing has been proven on this, but there is research happening to look into it. Then there's the idea of certain hormones playing a role. So hormones like estrogen, which are produced in both men and women, but much higher amounts in women, could be partially to blame. But again, there's nothing directly proven on this stuff. All we know is that autoimmune conditions affect women more than they affect men. And then the other thing I wanted to mention around autoimmune issues is something I'm highlighting that I said earlier, is that if you have one autoimmune condition, it makes it more likely that you'll have others. And this is at least one of the reasons why I want to have clients who have a suspected thyroid issue to be screened for Hashimoto's. Because if we know that this is the case, we can then do things to deal with the immune system to try and prevent further damage. Whereas if this isn't done and someone just goes on thyroid medication, then it's more likely that in a couple of years or in a decade that they're then diagnosed with lupus or celiac or rheumatoid arthritis or sort of any of the other autoimmune conditions. So with this in mind, let's now talk about the immune system, because it's the immune system that really makes Hashimoto's different from standard hypothyroidism. And one thing I should just mention or point out is that I recently had Dr. Brian Walsh on the podcast, and we chatted about the immune system at length. So I highly suggest checking out that show. You can find it at www.7-health.com/91. So within the immune system, you have a number of different types of cells, which I want to run through. So first you have macrophages. And these are like Mr. and Mrs. Pac-Man, are stationed all around the body, and they engulf and digest cellular debris, foreign substances, microbes, cancer cells, and anything else that does not have the types of proteins that are specific to a healthy body cell on its surface. And with certain substances that they eat, they then signal back to the rest of the immune system to let it know what's going on. So when they engulf an antigen, the macrophage then becomes an antigen-presenting cell, or APC, which then alerts the rest of the immune system. So think of this like a burglar alarm of sorts. So your immune system, which is your white blood cells, they mature in two main areas within the body. And these two areas are the thymus gland and the bone marrow. So when something is a T cell, it matures in the thymus, so T, thymus, and when something is a B cell, it matures in the bone marrow, B for bone marrow. So let me go through some of the different T cells. So once that alarm is raised by the macrophage, you first see T helper cells. And these are cells that are kind of like organizers or managers, and they send messages to natural killer cells and to cytotoxic T cells to go in and destroy the antigen. So the best way to think of the natural killer cells and the cytotoxic T cells are like the SAS or the Navy SEALs. And it's great to be able to then turn on this stuff and to have the immune system attack an invader, but you also want to be able to have the ability to then call off the attack. So you then have T regulator cells who survey what is going on. And if things then need to be calmed down, you have T suppressor cells, which then stops the immune reaction once the intruders or the antigens have been dealt with. So I try and visualize it like a seesaw. So where you have T helper cells at one end, which stimulate the immune system. You then have T suppressor cells at the other end, which tells the immune system to calm down. And then in the middle, you have the T regulatory cells. And they are monitoring and orchestrating and telling which side needs to be increasing and which side needs to be decreasing. So the final cell I want to mention is the B cells, but let me just explain something about the immune system first. So your immune system can be split into two sides. It's not always a nice, clear demarcation, as there is a crossover with different cells between both sides, but this is just how you can think about it generally and how it's talked about. So first you have the innate immune system. And this is your generic immune system, and it's what is normally first on the scene and your first line of defense. So if a specific antigen turns up, then your body automatically responds in a certain way. It doesn't have to learn it. So whether you are a 10-year-old or you're a 50-year-old, it should be that same exact automatic response. Then you have the adaptive immune system, and this is the immune system that starts to learn things over time. So when you've had a specific illness, it takes notes and it learns from that experience. So the next time that pathogen turns up, it's ready and can immediately send out immune cells that are specific at killing that one thing. So back to the B cells. So when that macrophage engulfs the antigen, I said that it then stimulates T helper cells. The T helper cells, they don't just stimulate natural killer cells and cytotoxic T cells, they can also stimulate B cells. And these B cells then go in and they attach to that antigen and they learn all of its details. They read its mind, they find out everything about it. And this then gets fed back to the rest of the immune system, so that if that kind of pathogen then turns up again, they know more about it and they know what to do and they can react very quickly. So that is a very brief overview of the immune system. There are many, many different types of cytokines, interleukins, and other players I haven't mentioned, but I think it's just worth giving you that level of detail. And what I've described here is what should be happening. So how could things go wrong with an autoimmune situation or with Hashimoto's? In Dr. Karazian's book, he mentions some different possibilities. So some people don't produce enough T suppressor cells, so an immune attack goes on relentlessly. And unfortunately, the thyroid gland then suffers collateral damage. Some people produce too much of certain substances that stimulate the natural killer cells and the cytotoxic T cells. And similarly to having too few T suppressor cells, this then can lead to collateral damage of the thyroid and to other tissues. Chronic viruses can often make this type of thing more likely. Some people produce too much of certain substances that create more B cells. And the B cells are the ones that attach to and write information about specific intruders. And because of the abundance of these B cells, they can start to attach to something innocuous and mark it as deadly. And then from now on, when someone is exposed to this substance, the immune system starts to respond. Parasitic infections and multiple food intolerances can make this more common. And more generally, anything that affects the thymus gland or the bone marrow or other areas that the immune system goes to mature and learn can make autoimmune issues more likely. And I remember reading an article many years ago by Dr. Ray Peat, and he was talking about autoimmune issues. And from his perspective, he was blaming a lot of it on inadequate amounts of carbohydrates and excessive amounts of estrogen. So the thymus is very glucose dependent, and when it's in low amounts, it affects its function. Estrogen can overstimulate the immune system. It can then also overstimulate the stress response, and it negatively affects the thymus. And this could do some way of explaining why these issues are more common in women and why they are on the increase now with the trend of the last decade of everyone going low carb. He also linked it into stress and the work of Hans Selye. So Selye did a lot of early work on stress with rats, and when he would do the autopsies on the rats, they would always have this triad of issues, which were peptic ulcers, enlarged adrenal glands, and shrunken thymus. So the combination of stress and high estrogen and low carbohydrates can affect the thymus and can potentially lead to autoimmune issues. And just so we're clear, I'm not saying that this is the final answer and that I think that this is the absolute reason that it is happening, but it does make a lot of sense to me. So there's one more idea around the immune system that I want to mention. And again, this is something I talked about with Dr. Brian Walsh, which is TH1 and TH2. So TH stands for T helper. So earlier I was talking about T helper cells and how they help to encourage the natural killer cells and the cytotoxic T cells as well as the B cells. Well, you actually have two different types of TH cells. Th1 cells are the ones that are encouraging the natural killer cells and the cytotoxic T cells, and then the Th2 cells are the ones that are encouraging the B cells. And what can happen in autoimmune conditions, as well as in other situations, is that one side of the TH, either Th1 or Th2, becomes dominant over the other. So instead of there being this nice balance, it is really skewed. And the thing I'd say with this is it's still all a little murky. You can have lists of conditions that are linked to, say, Th1 dominance or Th2 dominance, but it isn't always the case. So if you look at the stats, it points towards the fact that for Hashimoto's clients, typically they are Th1 dominant, or that if someone has lupus, typically they're going to be Th2 dominant, but it's not set in stone. There is some testing around this, but it's not the cheapest and its accuracy is still up for debate. And what it does is it looks at cytokines, which are substances that are secreted by cells of the immune system. They're kind of like hormones of the immune system, where they tell certain cells to do more of this or less of that, or they stimulate these ones. So the test looks at different cytokines that are associated with Th1 and with Th2. They look at the overall numbers and which are in the higher amounts. And the idea is that if, say, someone is Th1 dominant, you then have them take substances that will help stimulate Th2 and then vice versa. So the other alternative then is, instead of doing the lab testing, is to try out some different herbs or different substances that are known to stimulate one side or the other side of the Th1 or Th2 and see how the person reacts. So, for example, echinacea stimulates Th1. If someone takes it and sees an improvement, you can then surmise that they are Th2 dominant and you need substances to stimulate Th1. Or you could give someone some green tree extract, which stimulates Th2, and see if things improve. If it does, give more Th2 stimulating stuff. If things get worse, this person could need Th1 compounds instead. And again, the issue with this is it's not so clear cut. So there's plenty of substances that can stimulate both T1 and T2. Or you consult one paper and it says that something is a Th1 compound. And then you look at another and it says it's a Th2 compound. So there's not a huge amount of consensus on all of the different substances. But I guess the point of me going into all this is to explain that some of the different options that are available for people, but more so just to highlight that with Hashimoto's, a big component of it is the immune side of things. And this needs to be addressed in some way, whether that's done through food or herbs or supplements or lifestyle changes, and normally a combination of all of those things. So the next area I want to touch on is around gluten sensitivity or food sensitivities. And this is something talked about a lot with Hashimoto's and autoimmune diseases in general. It's something that's been picked up massively by the paleo community, and I've seen like endless blogs and articles on the autoimmune paleo protocol. So before I go into this, let me just comment on what I have found in practice. With Hashimoto's, I do find that clients are more likely to be sensitive to gluten or to other substances, but not in all cases. And in terms of gluten, often it's talked about it. If someone has Hashimoto's, they should automatically be on a gluten-free diet and they should be doing this for the rest of their life. And it's often not just gluten. It's that they're told that they automatically should be removing dairy, automatically should be removing eggs. For me, if I was to estimate, I would say probably about 50-50 split. So about half of my clients notice a big difference from going gluten-free. So they remove it from their diet and within days or within weeks, things are noticeably better. And this could be better with digestion, with tiredness, pain, brain fog, anxiety, sleep, etc. But for the other half of clients, when they remove it, they notice no difference. And then when they reintroduce it, they notice no difference. And I want clients to have as few restrictions as possible. There isn't likely to be damage to someone's health if they remove gluten unnecessarily. But at the same time, if they like the food and it's not causing the problem, then I don't see why they shouldn't be eating it. So I know when I read lots of books and articles around this stuff, it can be pretty alarmist, and you're told this long list of foods that you're now going to have to remove. But in reality, like for me, I suggest figuring out what makes a difference and what doesn't, rather than just cutting out this huge section of food from now until death do you part. So with gluten, there are a handful of reasons why it can be more problematic with Hashimoto's. So the first reason is something that we've already touched on, which is that if you have one autoimmune condition, it makes it more likely that you're going to have another one or you're going to have multiple ones. And one such autoimmune condition is celiac disease. So one of the people, also some of the people with Hashimoto's who do poorly on gluten, they do so because they also have Hashimoto's. The second reason is because of the shape of the gluten molecule, or actually just the gliadin portion of it, which closely resembles that of thyroid cells. And when this then gets into the bloodstream, it stimulates the immune response, and this then flares up the immune system and it revs it up, and then it further attacks the thyroid. And I think this can happen in both directions. And what I mean by this is that someone starts to react to gluten, and because of this, it causes them to attack the thyroid, and therefore they then get Hashimoto's. Or they could develop Hashimoto's, and because of this, when the immune system then sees the gluten, it starts to attack it, which then further perpetuates the attack on the thyroid. The third reason, which kind of links into the last thing I just chatted about, is to do with poor digestion. And it's the fact that gluten isn't being digested properly before it's then making its way into the bloodstream. And it's not just about gluten, this can be many different foods. And if they're making their way into the bloodstream when they're incompletely broken down, the immune system can see this as a foreign invader. And if the B cells then go over and mark these things as something to keep an eye on, the next time that this food is eaten, it makes its way into the bloodstream, then the attack is even more forceful. And digestive issues can be coming up for lots of different reasons. And it can be a bit of a chicken and egg with this stuff, because with hyperthyroidism in general, it leads to worse digestion. So maybe it was the thyroid that kicked this off, and then over time, digestion then gets worse, etc. Or maybe it's the other way around, and it was because of poor lifestyle and poor eating habits that then created the digestive issues, and then that led to the thyroid issues. So food sensitivities are more likely to be an issue with Hashimoto's, and because of the link between these sensitivities and the immune system and the knock-on effect that this then can have on the thyroid gland, these issues can make Hashimoto's worse. So it is worth doing some investigation with this stuff and paying attention to symptoms and to do a food log. Stress is another area I want to mention. It's often common with Hashimoto's and autoimmune diseases in general. But stress, as I mentioned earlier, in respect to, say, the thyroid, the thymus gland, can have a real negative direct impact on the immune system and how it functions and the kind of immune cells that is then maturing. And there's the big stresses in life that most people think about when they hear the word. So someone dying, a company going under that you manage, getting a divorce, like these big obvious stresses. But it's often more of the insidious forms of stress that people don't even think about of stress or as stress that over the long term creates the problems. So getting less sleep than you need, going too long between meals, eating in a rush, not having proper downtime, trying to do too much, dieting, never saying no to people. It's this kind of stuff that I'm regularly working on with clients. And it's because these kind of things, when people keep them up for years and years, really corrode health. And in a lot of the books and the articles around Hashimoto's, this is often described as blood sugar imbalances. And it's often blamed on eating processed foods and having too many carbohydrates. But there's lots of clients who suffer with this who are very healthy eaters and aren't living on processed foods. But it's the irregularity with their eating, it's the dieting, it's the late nights, it's all of the other things that I just mentioned that then have an impact. And this is very common with Hashimoto's, but I'd also say this is very common with most chronic diseases that people deal with. So in someone, it leads to Hashimoto's. In someone else, it's IBS. Someone else, it's endometriosis. Someone else, it's diabetes. So there's no way that this is exclusive to Hashimoto's, but I do want to mention it because it is a really big factor. So the final thing I want to mention before wrapping this up is medication. And I know I briefly touched on this earlier on, but I want to just make a few more comments. And I do want to preface this by saying I'm not a doctor, or in the words of Tim Ferriss, I'm not a doctor and I don't pretend to play one on the internet. So my comments here are based on what I've read and what I've experienced in practice with clients who've been on different medications prescribed by their doctor. I don't prescribe medication. I don't tell clients to go on or come off medication. So with Hashimoto's and with hypothyroid symptoms in general, the standard medication is a synthetic form of T4 or thyroxine. And this comes under lots of different brand names. So you have Levo-T, levothyroxine, Levoxil, Novothyrox, Synthroid, and Unithroid. And the idea is that with hypothyroidism, the body isn't producing adequate amounts of T4, and by increasing the T4, that things will start to get better. And in some cases, this is true. Simply by increasing the T4, health improves. But unfortunately, it's not always the case. And I talked before about the hormone cascade with the thyroid and how T4 is converted into T3, and it's actually the T3 that is the active form of thyroid, and T4 is a prothyroid. T2 is also an active form, but we know less about it, and I don't want to get into that now. So really, it's the T3 that does most of the heavy lifting in terms of making someone feel better. And the issue is that just increasing T4 doesn't guarantee that this will be converted into T3. And in fact, often this doesn't happen. And the issue is that regularly this is missed. Even when someone has been diagnosed as being hypothyroid, even when working with a doctor, when they're trying to work out the medication and what's appropriate and getting the dosage correct, this is just based on their TSH and their T4 numbers, and T3 is very rarely checked. And this is talked about in length in Stop the Thyroid Madness. So Jenny Bowthorpe, the author, she suffered for years, or it might have even been decades, where she was only given T4. It brought her TSH and T4 numbers into a supposedly healthy range, but she didn't feel healthy at all, and she was still plagued with symptoms. So on top of T4 medication, there is also a synthetic form of T3 that someone can take. And this comes under the brand name of Cytomel and leothyronine. And this then helps to provide the body with T3, so that even if the body isn't being so successful at making that conversion from T4 to T3, the body is still getting the T3 that it needs. And because T3 is the thyroid hormone that is needed for cells to function properly, for energy production, for, as I said, most of the heavy lifting stuff around thyroid, when people get good amounts of T3, this is typically when they start to notice a difference. So this means that someone can be on two different types of medication, so medication for T4 and medication for T3, and that these are two separate medications. There is an alternative to the synthetic forms of these hormones, and these are called natural desiccated thyroid, or NDT. And probably the best known brand of this is Armour, but there are other brands. So there's Nature-Throid, Thyroid S, and then different countries. So Australia, New Zealand, Germany, Canada, they have their own brands. And with the natural desiccated thyroid, or the NDT, how this is made is it comes from the thyroid of animals, and it's typically from pigs. So it's the gland or the glandula of that animal. And this is how thyroid medication was originally made before there was the synthetic versions. Now, for lots of people, they feel better on the NDTs. And I know in the alternative health field, it's often talked about as like this godsend, that when people switch from just T4 to having, say, Armour, things were like night and day. And I'm not saying that this is everyone's experience and it can take time to work out dosage, but there are a lot of very glowing testimonials around this. But I've had many clients who've mentioned to their doctors about changing over medication so that they can go on Armour or one of the other forms of NDT and coming up against resistance. And the most common reason that they are told no, they don't want to put them on this is they're told that the medication, because it comes from the animals, because it is a glandular, that it is not standardized from one batch to the next. So one batch can be very high, the next batch can be very low, that there's no standardization, it's not routine. And in reality, this isn't true. So with the NDT medications, they are all standardized for T4 and T3. So each tablet, depending on which brand it is and their intended mix, will have the exact same amount of T4 and T3 from batch to batch. And in Dr. Alan Christensen's book, he talks about the fact that Armour and other NDTs, because of it comes from the thyroid gland of the animal, you can get other substances that gland also produce. So they standardize the T4 and T3 and test those amounts, but there's other things that then can come alongside with it. And he's stating this as being a good thing. And he's saying that someone can then also get T2, they can also get T1, they can also get calcitonin, and that these can be supportive. But there are people who talk about the fact that there can be some drawbacks to this, and that this is especially the case with Hashimoto's patients. So Dr. Mark Starr, he points out that the NDTs, not only containing some of those other beneficial things, could contain amounts of TPO, could contain amounts of thyroglobulin, and because these are the substances that the autoimmune antibodies are attacking, this can then further lead to an increased attack of the thyroid gland. And so his recommendation is that you be better off giving the synthetic forms of T4 and T3. From what I've read, it seems like it's kind of only a small subset of sufferers, not all Hashimoto's patients, that have that issue with it revving up the attack on the thyroid, and the majority of people seem to do better on it. But I did want to just mention it, just because often online there's just unanimous praise of Armour, and you get this idea that everyone who goes on it is going to have these amazing improvements in their symptoms, and I just want to show that maybe that's not always going to be the case. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that with this stuff, it's going to take a little bit of trial and error. And if possible, it's worth working with a doctor who's then going to be open about working with you on this stuff and trying out different things. So that is it for this podcast on Hashimoto's. Really, I've just barely scratched the surface on this stuff, and there is so much more that I could have gone into. But even in this abridged form, hopefully you picked up some helpful tips and information. So next week, I'm going to be back again as usual. It will be another guest interview. So until then, have a great week, and I will catch you soon.
Thanks for listening.